Get back to work." The harsh command shattered the 3 a.m. silence at the Apollo Theater as stage manager Roberts caught Marcus Johnson sitting at the piano instead of mopping the floors. What Roberts didn't see was Ray Charles standing in the shadows, watching the 22-year-old janitor play a piece of music so complex and beautiful that it had stopped the legendary performer dead in his tracks. Marcus had thought the theater was empty when he'd allowed himself those precious few minutes at the piano, the only time in his 12-hour workday when he could touch the keys he dreamed about every night. The melody flowing from his fingers was an original composition, born from 8 months of listening to rehearsals while cleaning, absorbing every note, every rhythm, every nuance of music he wasn't supposed to understand. Ray Charles had arrived early for sound check and heard something that defied explanation, a night janitor playing music that could have been composed by a master, performed with technique that rivaled conservatory graduates. What Ray Charles did next would prove that true musical genius can't be hidden by uniforms, poverty, or society's expectations about who gets to make music. But to understand why this midnight encounter would become the most important 3 minutes in both men's lives, you need to know about the musical prodigy who had been forced to hide his gift behind a custodian's uniform, waiting for someone who could recognize brilliance regardless of where they found it. It was October 15, 1962, at the legendary Apollo Theater in Harlem. Ray Charles was scheduled to perform his evening show, but he'd arrived 6 hours early to work on new arrangements. The theater was supposed to be empty, except for the skeleton night crew, but Ray had always preferred the solitude of an empty venue for his most creative work. Marcus Johnson had been working the graveyard custodial shift at the Apollo for 8 months, invisible to almost everyone who passed through the building. At 22 years old, he was officially employed as a floor maintenance technician, earning $1.35 an hour to keep the theater clean between shows and rehearsals. What his employment file didn't mention was that Marcus possessed perfect pitch, an intuitive understanding of harmonic structure, and the ability to hear a song once and reproduce it with improvements. For 8 months, Marcus had been living a double life. By day he was a struggling young man from Spanish Harlem who cleaned floors and emptied trash cans. By night, in the stolen moments between cleaning duties, he was a composer whose musical imagination knew no boundaries. Every rehearsal he'd cleaned up after had been a master class in musical education. Every conversation between musicians he'd overheard while working had been a lesson in advanced music theory. But Marcus kept his abilities hidden. In his world, young black men from the projects didn't become composers. They got jobs, worked hard, and stayed grateful for whatever opportunities they could find. The idea that he might belong on stage instead of cleaning it seemed like a fantasy too dangerous to entertain. Tonight, however, Marcus had made a critical error in judgment. He'd assumed the theater was completely empty when he'd sat down at the piano to work through a musical idea that had been haunting him for weeks. The melody was a complex fusion of gospel chord progressions with jazz improvisation, something he'd been hearing in his head every night as he fell asleep. What Marcus didn't know was that Ray Charles never announced his arrival at venues. The legendary performer had a habit of entering through service entrances, avoiding crowds and complications. He preferred to observe his performance spaces quietly, getting a feel for the acoustics and the energy before anyone knew he was there. So when Ray Charles walked through the backstage entrance at 3:15 a.m., he expected to find an empty theater. Instead, he heard music that made him stop breathing. Someone was playing piano with a level of sophistication and originality that Ray recognized as extraordinary. Even by his own impossibly high standards, Ray Charles moved closer to the sound, his trained ears analyzing what he was hearing. The harmonic progressions were advanced. The melodic development was sophisticated. The emotional content was profound. This wasn't someone playing existing music. This was someone creating music, in real time, with the kind of intuitive brilliance that couldn't be taught. As Ray reached the wings of the stage, he could see the source of the music, a young man in a custodial uniform, completely absorbed in his performance, playing with his eyes closed and his whole body moving with the rhythm. Ray Charles recognized something in that posture, that total surrender to musical expression. He'd seen it in mirrors his entire life. For 3 minutes, Ray Charles stood transfixed, listening to music that challenged his understanding of where genius could be found. This wasn't a conservatory-trained musician. This wasn't someone with access to private lessons or expensive instruments. This was someone who had learned to make music the way Ray Charles himself had learned, through pure necessity, because not making music wasn't an option. Then stage manager Roberts arrived for his 3:20 a.m. security check. "Get back to work." Roberts' voice exploded through the theater like a gunshot. Marcus jumped up from the piano bench as if he'd been caught stealing, immediately grabbing his mop and bucket with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd been yelled at before. "I'm sorry, mister." "Roberts," Marcus said quickly, his voice carrying the careful deference of someone who couldn't afford to lose his job. "I just finished the main floor, and I was just testing the keys to make sure they were clean." Roberts wasn't buying the explanation. "Johnson, you're here to clean, not to play piano. This is the 3rd time I've caught you near that instrument when you should be working. One more violation, and you're out." Ray Charles watched this exchange from the shadows, his anger building with every word. He'd witnessed plenty of injustice in his life, but there was something particularly galling about watching genuine musical genius being treated like criminal behavior. "Mr. Roberts," Marcus said, his voice becoming smaller, "I understand. It won't happen again." The resignation in his voice was heartbreaking. Here was someone with extraordinary talent accepting that his gifts were inappropriate, unwelcome, and dangerous to his survival. Ray Charles had heard enough. "Excuse me," Ray Charles said, stepping into the light. His voice carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being listened to, but Roberts was too focused on asserting his own authority to recognize who was speaking. "Sir, the theater is closed," Roberts said without turning around. "If you're looking for the box office, it doesn't open until 10 a.m. He was still glaring at Marcus, who was now gripping his mop handle with white knuckles. "I'm not looking for the box office," Ray Charles replied calmly. "I'm looking for whoever was just playing that piano." The quality of Ray's voice, that distinctive, unmistakable sound that had made him famous, finally registered with Roberts, who spun around in shock. "Mr. Charles, I didn't realize you were here so early." Roberts' demeanor changed instantly, from authoritarian to obsequious. "Is there anything you need? Sound check isn't scheduled for another 3 hours." Ray Charles ignored the question and looked directly at Marcus, who was standing frozen with his cleaning supplies, afraid to move or speak. "Son, was that you playing just now?" Marcus glanced nervously at Roberts, then back at Ray Charles. The question was simple, but the answer could cost him his job. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. I was just cleaning the keys. That's the most interesting key cleaning I've ever heard." Ray Charles said with a slight smile, "What was that piece you were playing?" It was nothing, sir, just something I was humming." Marcus was clearly terrified, caught between his admiration for Ray Charles and his fear of Robert's authority. Robert stepped forward, trying to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Charles, I apologize for this disruption. Johnson here was supposed to be working, not playing around with the piano. I'll make sure it doesn't happen again." Ray Charles turned his attention to Roberts, and something in his posture shifted. "Mr. Roberts, how long has this young man been working here?" "About 8 months," Roberts replied, confused by the question. "He's part of our custodial staff, very reliable worker, but he has a tendency to get distracted by the musical equipment." "Distracted," Ray Charles repeated, his voice carrying a dangerous edge. "Is that what you call it when someone demonstrates that level of musical ability?" Roberts looked genuinely puzzled. "Musical ability, Mr. Charles, he's a janitor. He has no musical training. He's just playing around." The dismissive tone in Robert's voice triggered something deep in Ray Charles' memory. He'd heard that tone before directed at him, when people couldn't see past his blindness to recognize his talent. He'd heard it directed at countless other musicians who didn't fit society's expectations of what a performer should look like. Just playing around. Ray Charles repeated slowly, "Mr. Roberts, I've been making music professionally for 20 years. I've worked with the best musicians in the world. What I just heard wasn't someone playing around. What I heard was someone composing original music at a level that most trained musicians never reach." Marcus Johnson stood completely still, afraid to breathe, afraid to hope. No one had ever described his music as anything other than noise or distraction. The idea that Ray Charles, had not only heard him play, but recognized value in his music, seemed impossible. "Sir," Roberts said carefully, clearly uncomfortable with the direction this conversation was taking, "I'm sure you're being generous, but Johnson here doesn't have any formal training. He's never taken lessons. He can't even read music." "Can't read music," Ray Charles said, and now there was unmistakable amusement in his voice. "Mr. Roberts, I can't see music. Does that mean I can't play it?" The comparison hit Roberts like a physical blow. He just implied that someone couldn't be a real musician because they couldn't read sheet music, while talking to a blind man who had revolutionized American music without ever seeing a note. Ray Charles walked closer to Marcus, who was still frozen in place. "Son, what's your name?" "Marcus Johnson, sir." "Marcus, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. How long have you been playing piano?" Marcus glanced again at Roberts, who was watching this exchange with growing unease. "I've been teaching myself, sir, since I started working here. I listen to the rehearsals while I clean, and I try to figure out how the music works." "How the music works," Ray Charles repeated thoughtfully. "That's an interesting way to put it. Most people learn songs. It sounds like you've been learning music itself." The distinction was subtle but profound, and Marcus's face showed that he understood exactly what Ray Charles meant. "Yes, sir. I try to understand why certain chords make people feel certain ways, why some rhythms make you want to dance, and others make you want to cry." Ray Charles nodded approvingly. "That's not something you can learn from books, Marcus. That's something you either understand or you don't, and it's very clear that you understand it." Robert, sensing that his authority was being undermined, tried to reassert control. "Mr. Charles, I appreciate your interest in the staff, but Johnson has work to finish before his shift ends. Perhaps we could continue this conversation another time." "Actually," Ray Charles said, his voice taking on a tone that brooked no argument, "I think Marcus's shift just changed. Marcus, how would you feel about helping me with sound check?" The question hung in the air like a miracle. Marcus Johnson, night janitor, was being invited to work with Ray Charles. It seemed too incredible to be real. I don't know if I'm qualified, sir," Marcus said hesitantly. "Let me be the judge of that," Ray Charles replied. "Mr. Roberts, I'll take full responsibility for Marcus for the rest of the evening. His cleaning duties can wait." Roberts found himself in an impossible position. He couldn't refuse Ray Charles without risking a confrontation with the theater's most important performer. But allowing a janitor to participate in soundcheck violated every protocol he'd ever enforced. "Mr. Charles," Roberts said carefully, "the theater has strict policies about non-musical personnel interacting with performance equipment. For insurance reasons, for union reasons, it's just not possible." Ray Charles turned toward Roberts with the patient expression of someone who had spent a lifetime dealing with people who confused rules with wisdom. "Mr. Roberts, let me explain something to you about musical personnel. Musical personnel isn't determined by job titles or union cards. It's determined by whether someone can make music. And Marcus here can make music. But sir, he's not trained, he's not certified. If something goes wrong, Mr. Roberts," Ray Charles interrupted gently, "I'm going to share something with you. Some of the best musicians I've ever worked with never set foot in a conservatory. Some of the worst musicians I've ever worked with had degrees from the finest schools in the country. Talent doesn't follow organizational charts. Marcus was watching this conversation with amazement. Here was Ray Charles, defending his right to make music against the same authority figure who had been crushing his dreams for 8 months. It felt surreal, like a fantasy he might have imagined during his loneliest nights of cleaning. Furthermore, Ray Charles continued, "If Marcus here can play the way I heard him playing a few minutes ago, then the Apollo Theater has been wasting his talents for 8 months by keeping him behind a mop instead of behind a microphone." The statement was revolutionary. Ray Charles was suggesting that the theater's employment structure was fundamentally wrong, that they'd been overlooking talent because they'd been looking in the wrong places. Roberts was clearly struggling with the implications. "Mr. Charles, I don't make those kinds of decisions, I just enforce the policies that exist." "Well then," Ray Charles said with finality, "tonight we're going to create a new policy. Tonight talent gets recognized regardless of what uniform it's wearing." Ray Charles walked over to the piano and sat down at the bench. "Marcus, come here. I want to hear you play that piece again, all of it this time." Marcus looked at Roberts, who was standing in frustrated silence, then back at Ray Charles. The invitation was clear, but accepting it meant crossing a line he could never uncross. Once he played for Ray Charles, once he revealed the full extent of his abilities, there would be no going back to being just a janitor. "Don't worry about Mr. Roberts," Ray Charles said, reading Marcus's hesitation perfectly. "Worry about the music. That's all that matters right now." Marcus walked slowly to the piano, his heart pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. He sat down beside Ray Charles on the bench, his hands trembling as he placed them on the keys. "Now," Ray Charles said quietly, "play what you were playing before. Don't think about anything else. Just let the music come." Marcus closed his eyes and began to play. The first notes were tentative, uncertain, but as the melody developed, his confidence grew. The music that emerged was the same piece Ray Charles had heard from the shadows, but now he could observe Marcus's technique, his musical choices, his creative process. What Ray Charles witnessed was extraordinary. Marcus played with the kind of intuitive musicality that couldn't be faked or taught. His left hand provided a foundation that was both rhythmically complex and harmonically sophisticated, while his right hand spun melodic lines that were beautiful, original, and emotionally compelling. More impressively, Marcus began to improvise, taking the basic melodic theme and developing it in real time. He added jazz harmonies that shouldn't have worked but did. He incorporated rhythmic elements from different musical traditions, creating something that was simultaneously familiar and completely new. Ray Charles found himself leaning forward, studying Marcus's hands, trying to understand how someone with no formal training was making such sophisticated musical choices. It was like watching someone speak a language they'd never been taught, but speaking it fluently and eloquently. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Ray Charles asked when Marcus finished. "I taught myself," Marcus replied. "I listen to the rehearsals while I work. I try to understand what the musicians are doing, why they make the choices they make." "You taught yourself," Ray Charles repeated. "In 8 months, yes sir. Well, I'd played a little piano as a child, but nothing formal, nothing like this." Ray Charles was quiet for a moment, processing what he'd just witnessed. Self-taught musicians weren't uncommon, but self-taught musicians who could compose original music at this level were extraordinarily rare. "Marcus, I want you to play something else for me. Play something you've heard during rehearsals here, something you've learned by listening." Marcus nodded, and began playing "Georgia on My Mind," one of Ray Charles' signature songs. But he didn't just play it, he interpreted it, adding his own harmonic colors and rhythmic variations while maintaining the emotional core that made the song special. Ray Charles listened with growing amazement. Marcus wasn't just reproducing what he'd heard, he was understanding it, analyzing it, and improving upon it. His version of the song incorporated elements that even Ray Charles hadn't considered. "Stop," Ray Charles said suddenly. Marcus immediately lifted his hands from the keys, worried that he'd made a mistake. "Did I do something wrong?" Marcus asked anxiously. "Wrong?" Ray Charles shook his head. "Son, what you just did was extraordinary. You took my song, and you made it better. Do you understand how rare that is?" Marcus looked confused. "Better? I was just trying to play it the way I heard it in my head." "Exactly," Ray Charles said. "You weren't copying what you'd heard. You were creating what you imagined. That's the difference between a musician and an artist." Stage manager Roberts, who had been watching this exchange with growing bewilderment, finally found his voice. "Mr. Charles, I hate to interrupt, but we really do need to maintain some boundaries here. Johnson is custodial staff. Mixing job classifications creates problems with the union, with insurance." Ray Charles turned toward Roberts with an expression that was both patient and unmistakably firm. "Roberts, let me ask you something. If you discovered that one of your janitors was actually a brilliant doctor who was cleaning floors because no one would give him a chance to practice medicine, what would you do?" "That's different," Roberts replied. "Medicine is a profession. This is just what?" Ray Charles challenged. "Just music? Just the thing that keeps this theater in business? Just the thing that pays all our salaries?" Roberts realized he was losing ground in this argument, but he pressed on. "Mr. Charles, I understand your enthusiasm, but we have protocols. Johnson isn't a musician, he's maintenance staff." "According to who?" Ray Charles asked. "According to his job application. According to his paycheck?" "Mr. Roberts, I just heard him play music that most professional musicians couldn't reproduce. If that doesn't make him a musician, then the word doesn't mean anything." Marcus was listening to this conversation with a mixture of terror and hope. On one hand, he was grateful that Ray Charles was defending him. On the other hand, he was terrified that this confrontation would cost him his job. "Mr. Charles," Marcus said quietly, "I don't want to cause any problems. Mr. Roberts is right. I'm just custodial staff. I should stick to cleaning." Ray Charles turned back to Marcus with surprise. "Son, why would you say that?" "Because it's true," Marcus replied. "I don't have training. I don't have education. I don't have any right to be playing this piano." The words hit Ray Charles like a physical blow. Here was someone with extraordinary talent convinced that he didn't deserve to use it. Ray Charles recognized the voice of internalized oppression, the way society taught people to limit their own possibilities. "Marcus," Ray Charles said, his voice becoming more intense, "let me tell you something about rights. I didn't have the right to play piano either. I was a blind black kid from Georgia in the 1940s. Do you know how many people told me I didn't have the right to make music?" Marcus shook his head, transfixed by Ray Charles' sudden passion. "Everyone," Ray Charles continued. "Everyone told me that blind people couldn't perform, that black musicians belonged in certain genres and nowhere else, that I should be grateful for whatever small opportunities I could find. You know what I told them?" "What did you tell them?" Marcus asked. "I told them that talent doesn't ask permission, genius doesn't wait for invitations, and music doesn't care about anyone's opinion of who deserves to make it." The words hung in the air with the weight of lived experience. Ray Charles wasn't just giving advice, he was sharing the philosophy that had allowed him to become one of the most important musicians in American history. "But Mr. Charles," Marcus said hesitantly, You're Ray Charles. You're famous. You're successful. You're just what?" Ray Charles interrupted. "Just someone who can make music that stopped me in my tracks. Just someone who can improve on songs that I wrote." "Marcus, success doesn't create talent. Talent creates success, and you have more raw talent than most successful musicians I know." Roberts, who had been listening to this exchange with growing confusion, tried to regain control of the situation. "Mr. Charles, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but we really can't have custodial staff using performance equipment. It creates liability issues." Ray Charles stood up from the piano bench, and faced Roberts directly. "Mr. Roberts, let me make something very clear. I'm scheduled to perform here tonight. This theater is counting on that performance to generate revenue. If I decide that Marcus here is essential to that performance, then Marcus becomes musical personnel. Do we understand each other?" The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Ray Charles was leveraging his position to protect Marcus's opportunity. Roberts found himself trapped between his desire to enforce theater policy and his need to avoid conflict with their headline performer. "Mr. Charles," Roberts said carefully, "I understand your position, but I have to think about precedent. If we make exceptions for one employee, then you might discover that you have other exceptional employees," Ray Charles finished. "Mr. Roberts, precedent isn't always a good thing. Sometimes precedent is just another word for missed opportunities." Ray Charles turned back to Marcus, who was watching this conversation with the fascination of someone seeing his entire world rearranged in real time. "Marcus, I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly. If you could do anything with your life, anything at all, what would you do?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, afraid to voice dreams that had seemed impossible for so long. "I'd want to make music," he said finally. "I'd want to compose. I'd want to help people feel things through music the way your music makes me feel things." Ray Charles nodded. "That's what I thought. Now let me ask you another question. Are you willing to work harder than you've ever worked in your life to make that happen?" "Yes, sir." "Are you willing to practice until your fingers bleed? To study music theory until your brain hurts? To face rejection and criticism and people telling you you're not good enough?" "Yes, sir." "Good," Ray Charles said with satisfaction. "Because that's what it takes. Talent is just the starting point. Everything else is work." He turned back to Roberts. "Mr. Roberts, effective immediately, Marcus Johnson is going to be helping me with arrangements and compositions. I'll need him available for musical duties whenever I'm working here." Roberts looked like he was about to object, but Ray Charles held up a hand to stop him. "This isn't a request, Mr. Roberts. This is how it's going to be. The Apollo Theater has just discovered that they've been paying a composer to mop floors. I suggest we correct that situation." What followed was a musical collaboration that would become legendary in jazz circles. For the next 4 hours, Ray Charles and Marcus Johnson worked together developing new arrangements, exploring musical ideas, and pushing each other to creative heights that neither could have reached alone. Ray Charles discovered that Marcus possessed an intuitive understanding of harmonic theory that allowed him to suggest chord progressions and melodic developments that enhanced Ray's compositions in unexpected ways. Marcus discovered that his musical instincts, validated and encouraged by a master, could produce music that was both personally meaningful and professionally viable. "Marcus," Ray Charles said as they worked through a particularly complex arrangement, "I want you to understand something. What you're doing right now isn't unusual talent. This is exceptional talent. This is the kind of musical ability that could change your life completely." "What do you mean?" Marcus asked. "I mean that you could record music, you could perform, you could compose for other artists, you could have a career in music if you want it badly enough." The possibility seemed overwhelming to Marcus. "But I don't have connections. I don't have money for equipment or studio time. I don't even have decent clothes for auditions." Ray Charles smiled. "Marcus, you're talking to someone who started with nothing but musical ability and determination. Everything else can be figured out if the foundation is solid, and your foundation is very solid." As the sun began to rise over Harlem, Ray Charles made Marcus an offer that would change everything. "I'm going to be recording a new album in 3 months," Ray Charles said. "I want you to help me with the arrangements. I want you to co-write some of the songs, and I want you to play piano on several tracks." Marcus stared at Ray Charles in disbelief. "You want me to play on your album?" "I want you to help me make the best music possible," Ray Charles replied. "And based on what I've heard tonight, I think you can do that. But there was a condition. Marcus, if you're going to work with me, you can't be a janitor anymore. You'll need to quit this job and focus entirely on music. Can you handle that? The question was more complex than it appeared. Marcus's custodial job provided the only steady income he'd had in his adult life. Quitting meant gambling everything on a dream that had seemed impossible just hours earlier. I need this job, Mr. Charles. I support my mother. I can't just... I understand, Ray Charles said. That's why I'm offering you a salary as my assistant composer. It'll be more than you're making here, and it comes with the opportunity to learn from some of the best musicians in the business. Marcus felt like he was living in a dream. You're offering me a job, making music? I'm offering you a chance, Ray Charles corrected. What you do with that chance is up to you. Stage manager Roberts, who had been listening to this conversation with growing alarm, made one final attempt to maintain the status quo. Mr. Charles, the theater management will need to approve any changes to staff assignments. I can't just let Johnson abandon his duties without proper notice. Ray Charles looked at Roberts with the patience of someone explaining something very simple to someone very slow. Mr. Roberts, Marcus Johnson just received a better job offer. He's giving his notice. Tonight was his last shift as a janitor. Tomorrow he starts his new career as a musician. The finality in Ray Charles' voice made it clear that this wasn't a discussion. It was an announcement. 3 months later, Marcus Johnson was credited as co-writer and pianist on 3 tracks of Ray Charles's album, The Genius Hits the Road Again. The album went to number 1 on the R&B charts and number 5 on the pop charts, establishing Marcus as one of the most promising young composers in American music. But more importantly, the story of Ray Charles discovering Marcus Johnson in the janitor's closet became a powerful reminder that talent exists everywhere, often in the places where society least expects to find it. Ray Charles had proven that genius doesn't announce itself with credentials or formal training. Sometimes it whispers original melodies while mopping floors at 3 a.m., waiting for someone with the wisdom to recognize brilliance regardless of where they find it. The Apollo Theater quietly revised its policies to allow for more flexible job classifications and created a program to identify and develop talent among all staff members, not just performers. Ray Charles's intervention had transformed not just Marcus Johnson's life, but the theater's understanding of where musical ability might be hiding. Roberts, initially resistant to the changes, eventually became one of the program's strongest supporters after witnessing firsthand how Marcus's success elevated the entire theater's reputation. Years later, he would say that Ray Charles had taught him the difference between enforcing rules and recognizing opportunities. Marcus Johnson went on to become one of the most respected composers and arrangers in jazz and R&B music, working with artists ranging from Aretha Franklin to Miles Davis. But he never forgot his 8 months as a janitor, and he established a foundation to provide musical education and opportunities for young people from low-income backgrounds. Ray Charles didn't just give me a career, Marcus would say in interviews decades later. He gave me permission to believe in my own abilities. Sometimes that's all genius needs, someone who can recognize it and give it room to grow. The story of their meeting became a testament to the power of mentorship, the importance of looking beyond surface appearances, and the revolutionary potential of believing in talent wherever it's found. Ray Charles had proved once again that music doesn't care about social conventions, job titles, or anyone's expectations about who gets to be extraordinary. In a world that often judges people by their current circumstances rather than their potential, the Midnight Discovery at the Apollo Theater serves as a reminder that genius is everywhere, waiting for someone with the vision to recognize it and the courage to nurture it, regardless of what rules might stand in the way.